Welcome to the History Maven. Today we're going to talk about the murder of Emmett Till. He was a 14-year-old African American boy from Chicago who was killed in Mississippi in 1955. Now, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with this case already, but I am going to give you a full picture in this video today of what it was like to be African American in 1955 Mississippi, of Emmett's life, of the horrendous crime, the trial, and the subsequent aftermath of that trial. But first, let's talk about why a kid like Emmett, who was from Chicago, a really fun, cool place, would want to spend summer in the Mississippi Delta. Well, even to this day, neighborhoods in the Mississippi Delta look very different in the summer than from the rest of the year. You see, in the summer, the young grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins of Delta residents, they leave the cities where they have lived through the school year, and they spend June through August with their Mississippi relatives. So the streets fill with children looping the block on their bicycles, tossing footballs, running through the hissing sprinklers in their swimsuits, eating popsicles, having a blast, and presumably having a more wholesome and safer summer than they would in an urban setting like Chicago. This summer tradition has been occurring at least since the Great Migration of the 1910s to the 1970s. This is when a large volume of African Americans who had been living in the southern United States moved to northern cities like New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, and the most popular destination, Chicago. This was because Southern laws tended to be extremely oppressive, making business and land ownership difficult for black residents. In Mississippi, where the murder of Emmett Till occurs, African Americans had few options for making a living in the early 20th century. You generally had two choices. You could share a crop for wealthy white landowners. That means you rent the land and they get a huge cut of the earnings you make. Or you could seek work outside by moving out of state altogether, to cities in the north that had more industry and less stringent laws. So Emmett's grandfather chose to do the latter. He moved his family out of Webb, Mississippi to Chicago when Emmett's mother, Mamie, was still just a little baby. So Emmett Till grew up in Chicago's South Side. His mother was working as a clerk for the U.S. Air Force, and this income provided more money than most African Americans were making in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They were rather comfortable, as you can see by their lovely home. Now, Emmett's father, Lewis Till, had been killed in combat as a soldier during World War II, so Emmett never really got to know his dad, but his father had been rather abusive to Mamie, and he was court ordered to join the military prior to his death. But Emmett had a great life. He went to a wonderful elementary school that he loved called McGosh Grammar School. In memory of him, it was later renamed to Emmett Till Math and Science Academy. When Emmett was only 5, he contracted a deadly and damaging virus called polio, and the disease just left him with a little bit of a stutter, but oddly, and thank goodness, he was not teased by other children because Emmett was very humorous and outgoing. He was good at sports. He was always well dressed. His cousins, his classmates, they loved being around him because he played pranks and he was fearless. Emmett's mother, Mamie, was an amazing woman. She was known to be very strong and supportive and loving. For this reason, she later became a teacher in the public school system. But Emmett grew up to be a happy, well-adjusted child. And Emmett was turning 14 this summer. His uncle, Moses Wright, came from Mississippi to visit. Now, Uncle Moses told the most magnificent stories about farm life in the Delta, and all about the antics of all the Mississippi cousins who were around Emmett's age. And this made Emmett's cousin Wheeler Parker, who lived in Chicago, want to go with Uncle Moses. And Emmett said that he had to go too. He wanted to go experience all the fun with all his cousins down south. But Emmett's mother, Mamie, had serious misgivings about this idea. Her mother's house had been called Little Mississippi. It was a central meeting place for former Mississippians who had moved to Chicago. And imagine a sort of a support group. But these visitors would tell Mamie and her mother about all the injustices that were still happening to black people in the Delta, including hundreds of lynchings that never even made it to newspapers. Mamie had already planned a vacation for the summer. She was going to go to Omaha, and she wanted to take Emmett there and teach him to drive. but he begged to go to Money, Mississippi to his uncle's farm. And eventually she relented. So before seeing Emmett off on the train, she gave him his father's signet ring and a few other little items, and she explained that things were different in the South than Chicago. She told Emmett he should not look white people in the eye, only speak to them when spoken to, and exercise only the best of manners. Emmett promised his mother he understood, and Uncle Moses said, "Hey, let me offer you some reassurance. This town is so small. Money, Mississippi has less than 1,000 people. We're probably going to just be on the farm, and we're not going to see too many people outside of family." And that gave her some sense of relief. So she saw him off on the train, and that was to be the last time that Mamie saw her little boy alive, because on August 21st, 1955, Emmett arrived at his uncle Moses' farm. And for a few days, Emmett and other teens from the neighborhood were just helping with the cotton harvest. They goofed off on the property, playing with animals, shooting marbles. But it was hot outside and they'd been working very hard, so they decided to take a break. On August 24th, all the boys decided to go to the only little store in town. They went to Bryant's grocery and meat market for the little snacks and drinks they wanted. And Emmett and his cousin Curtis Jones stayed in the grocery store. The other boys decided to hightail it across the street and have fun playing some checkers. But there was a pretty dark-haired white woman in the store, 21-year-old Carolyn Bryant. She was the wife of the store owner, and she was watching shop that day. And what happens next varies by who is telling the story. But originally, Carolyn told her husband that Emmett had wolf whistled at her. I can't whistle, so I can't demonstrate. Feel free to look that up if you want to know what a wolf whistle is. In trial, however, Carolyn made the statement that Emmett not only wolf whistled at her, that he put his hands on her waist, asked her on a date, and told her that he had been with white women before. A witness, a white person in the store who claimed to be there during the incident, said that Emmett was showing other boys a picture in his wallet of a white girl that he was telling everyone was his girlfriend, and so his friends dared him to whistle at Carolyn, and he did. One of Emmett's friends said there was no picture or conversation, but that Emmett did wolf whistle at the woman, just trying to get a laugh out of them. Allegedly, Carolyn Bryant later recanted the statements that she made years later. She said in a book that Emmett hadn't touched her or made any illicit comments. She had been coached to change that story for the trial to make Emmett's kidnapping seem more justified. Carolyn was telling everybody in town this story. Carolyn's husband, Roy Bryant, and his friend J.W. Washington initially went to look for the boy that supposedly wolf whistled at his wife, and they grabbed up a random black teenager they saw on the side of the road and interrogated him and his family. But witnesses promised that this was not the young man, that the young man that had been to the store that day was Emmett Till, also called Bobo, and that he was a kid from Chicago who was staying with Moses Wright. So gossip about this interrogation got back to Emmett, and he just wanted to get back to Chicago right away. His cousins were saying this is bad, particularly the ones from Mississippi who knew how dangerous things could be for young African Americans in the Delta. But he was too scared to say anything to his Uncle Moses about what had transpired in the store. So on August 28th, Roy Bryant took out his half-brother J.W. Millam, and they went to Moses' house with a pistol. They grabbed Emmett up and his cousins out of bed. They threatened Moses Wright, and they told Emmett to get dressed. Dragged him to the truck, which was parked outside, where they asked a woman, according to witnesses, presumably Carolyn, if Emmett was the boy from the store, and they heard a lady say yes. So Emmett's aunt began begging the men, "Here, I'll give you money if you leave him." Moses said, "Please, just beat him and I'll be satisfied. You can hit him if you want to, and I won't do anything about it." But that was not what Bryant and Millam had in mind, so they tied up Emmett and threw him in the back seat of the truck. Witnesses say that there were also two African-American men, a couple of Millam's workers, who were also in the truck that had been recruited to aid in beating and pistol whipping Emmett to death. Now, one witness, Willie Reed, said he actually heard crying and screaming sounds that were coming from Millam's barn. He saw Millam step outside and threateningly asked Willie if he heard anything, and he said, "No, I didn't. I didn't hear anything." Another person said they heard noises and saw one of Millam's employees washing blood off his hands and boots. But Millam said, "Oh no, he just killed the deer." They ended up shooting Emmett. They weighted his body down with a stolen farm fan from a cotton gin, and they tossed his body over the Black Bayou Bridge. Emmett's family immediately contacted Sheriff George Smith and Sheriff H.C. Strider about the disappearance. And when the sheriffs confronted Bryant Millam, they said, "Yeah, we kidnapped him, and we questioned Emmett. We threatened him a little, but we just let him go. It was the wrong kid." However, 3 days later, Emmett's naked, disfigured corpse was soon retrieved from the river. Sheriff H.C. Strider said, "No, no, that's not him. This isn't a little teenage 14-year-old. This is a grown man. Look how big he is. He's got chest hairs, and he's so large." But Emmett was large and mature for his age. Emmett's own family actually had difficulty identifying him at first because he had no clothing on, and his face was so swollen and mutilated by the abuse and the time spent in the river. It was actually by that signet ring that his mother had given him that he was later identified. The slaying of Emmett Till brought public attention to the fact that lynchings were still happening in Mississippi, as well as a host of other injustices against black Mississippians, such as African Americans being prevented from voting, and outrage swept the nation. Mamie Till Bradley had her only child ripped from her in a most brutal and cruel manner. Mamie demanded that Emmett's body be sent to Chicago. She didn't want this murder to be swept under the rug in Mississippi, as so many had been, and forgotten, so she opted for Chicago funeral and for a Chicago autopsy. Because Emmett's body was so unrecognizable from the abuse he experienced in his final moments and the manner in which his body was disposed of, many people begged her to close the casket because it was a horrendous sight. But she wouldn't hear of it. She wanted the world to see this is the truth of what happened to her little boy. They need to face it. A minimum of 15,000 people stood in the streets outside the funeral home in support of Mamie and Emmett. Thousands upon thousands attended his funeral. Mamie courageously had pulled back the veil on segregationist society, and the whole world was watching. The trial of Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam began in Sumner, Mississippi in September of 1955, and the jury were, surprise, all white men who made no secret that they had no intention of convicting Bryant and Millam under any circumstances. The black spectators of the trial said that Sheriff H.C. Strider called them the N-word, and he tried to prevent them from even being in the courthouse, but it was overruled. Now, the defense attorneys for Bryant and Millam suggested, "This can't be Emmett. He's still alive somewhere." They posited that the body was actually an adult. They suggested that maybe Mamie had faked Emmett's death for insurance money or just to stir up unrest between blacks and whites in the region. Moses Wright testified about the events of the night that Emmett was kidnapped. He knew that for testifying, he was going to have to leave his farm in the Delta for this action. He had to immediately be swept out of the Delta for Chicago after the trial because he was the first black man to testify against a white man in Mississippi and live. Bryant and Millam testified that they had released Emmett unharmed. The trial lasted only 5 days, and Bryant and Millam were acquitted. The judge says there wasn't sufficient evidence that the body was actually Emmett's. The acquittal of these men showed the world the danger of segregation and white supremacy, and this jump-started the most active period of the civil rights movement. The NAACP had record numbers of enrollments. Emmett's death inspired Rosa Parks' refusal to move seats for a white man on a bus, which sparked a boycott of the public bus system. Martin Luther King Jr., who was to unite a nation, was stirred to take up the civil rights cause after Emmett's murder. Emmett became a symbol of bravery in the face of resistance. Desegregation movements of Southern schools and businesses occurred heavily for the next 18 years at great risk. to those who were courageous enough to take a stand against unfair laws, practices, all of these wickedness that was targeting African Americans of the time. Many white Americans did not accept the laws that guaranteed equality and facility sharing with black Americans. They were not in favor of change. Civil rights activists had to fight to dismantle these laws, and they were often met with absolutely violent resistance in their efforts. There were many assassinations of civil rights leaders of the time. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, these were laws put into place by the United States government to protect the rights of minorities, and civil rights leaders inspired by Emmett fought for these rights. Mamie Till Mobley spoke out against hate crimes and inequality for the rest of her life. Because she had shared her grief with the whole world and lobbied for civil rights, she assured that Emmett did not die in vain. It was thanks to Mamie and the Wright family that Emmett's death was a catalyst for change. Emmett was laid to rest in Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois. His murder had moved a nation. Carolyn Bryant, Emmett's accuser, is said to have spent her life in remorse for her part in Emmett's murder. She said, "Nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him." According to her, her husband isolated from others after that, moving her from place to place so she couldn't tell the truth. She eventually divorced Bryant. The alleged killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, were noted to have confessed the murder to Look magazine, though they later recanted the statements. The magazine said the men hadn't intended to kill Emmett, but no matter how much they beat and whipped him, he kept maintaining he was as good as they were. They said that Emmett didn't know his place. After they shot Emmett and threw him in the river, they burned his clothes at Millam's house. Both men received hundreds of threats and harassing calls each year. In the end, the community that had supported them during this trial, well, they didn't want to be associated with Emmett Till's killers anymore. Millam actually died destitute, and Bryant served jail time for food stamp fraud. If they ever felt any remorse for the murder, those regrets were never shared on a public platform. They both died as villains in the pages of history.